Right, welcome back, everybody. So the 6th ANC National Policy Conference starts at the Johannesburg Expo Centre today. Delegates will discuss the party's policies ahead of its national conference in December, when the ANC leadership for the next 5 years will be elected. Party President Cyril Ramaphosa is expected to address the gathering later this morning, this afternoon, sometime today. Who knows? We don't know. We just get told the timing, and we're there to take it live for you. But somebody who's going to be there the whole weekend, and it's going to be a very tiring one for him, is from, of course, the SABC politics team, Samkele Maseko. Samkele, I know 7 o'clock was when we were expecting it to happen, that briefing moved to 8 o'clock. Who knows what time it'll happen? But one thing's for sure, it's going to be one of those weekends. Are you ready for it? Good morning to you.
Yes, indeed, Leanne. It will be one of those weekends where we are anticipating that the ANC will have a festival of ideas and battles when it comes to the issues of policy within the African National Congress. We do know that the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal has said that they want the ANC to fully implement the 54th National Conference resolution of land expropriation without compensation, as per they resolved at this same very venue in 2017. There is also an issue of energy security within the country that the nation is currently battling with power utility Eskom. That's going to be at the center of deliberations, and also the economic transformation of this country. But all of that will only begin once the ANC's head of policy, Jeff Radebe, takes to that platform to brief the media on the processes that will unfold at this year's policy conference, the 6th policy conference of the ANC. The president of the governing party, Cyril Ramaphosa, is expected to open this 6th policy conference of the African National Congress at about 11 o'clock this morning. There are some provinces that have also raised the issue of the step-aside resolution that was resolved upon by the ANC here at the 54th National Conference. Limpopo and KwaZulu-Natal wants the step-aside policy to be scrapped in its entirety. Northern Cape, Mpumalanga, Free State and the Eastern Cape want the step-aside resolution to remain intact. So it's going to be a battle of provinces. But this time around, there is not going to be any voting, as it's going to be deliberations. Over 1,800 delegates coming from various provinces will be deliberating policies that are meant to eradicate poverty, inequality and eradicate corruption in the country, Leanne.
All right, and thanks so much, Samkele. And as we wait, we'll bring you that press conference as soon as it happens. But of course, what we are going to take a look at now is some of the policy positions, the documents we've scoured over, and of course, they will be deliberated upon here by the delegates as they descend on the Nasrec Expo Centre. Angelo Fick still with me. Angelo, just taking a look and picking up from what Samkele was saying. If we take a look at, for example, energy security, which is perhaps a good place to start, because these days anything you plan has to revolve around a load shedding schedule or some sort of security in terms of whether the energy will be available for your event. As it stands, we don't expect anything to go wrong, but of course this is a key issue here.
Absolutely, and I think one of the components of this energy policy is not just the so-called just transition or the idea of having a secure and reliable energy source, but the variety of other sources of energy that people have to have, including fuel and the fuel price increases that we've seen. So the shift to green energy, that's something that the policy document talks about as absolutely essential for future economic prospects because of the way in which carbon taxing is going to happen, and South Africa's access to remote markets for export is going to be affected. But then within a paragraph, the policy also contradictorily talks about offshore oil drilling and other forms of oil. And so one wants to sort of understand how these delegates are going to work through these kinds of contradictions. And it's not just on the energy policy that you see these kinds of contradictions. Sometimes there are contradictions one sentence after the other. And so one is curious to understand how the 2,000 delegates and the various people in the commissions will be dealing with these questions and trying to resolve them so that appropriate policy positions can come out of this, so that whenever policy positions are decided in government, there is policy certainty, and the track between a party's decisions and the government's implementation of those decisions is a lot more stable, because that influences a whole variety of other questions, including investment.
So if we look at those contradictions, how much of that do you think is informed by personality politics and, of course, what individuals stand to gain from all of this?
I think that is certainly something that has to be considered, because the ways in which Mr. Mantashe, as Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy, has articulated policy proposals on energy is often very different from what science tells us should be our investment, not just in terms of the South African goals, but in terms of survivability into the second half of the century. So people like me, who will end up turning 50 this year, will have a very different investment in the future from people who are currently 18 or 19. They're likely to have to live into the second half of the century. And South Africa's energy policy isn't just about whether we have lights and electricity to run the things that we currently run. It has to have its eye on the second half of the century. It has to have its eye on the unfolding climate catastrophe, and on not just mitigating the consequences of that, but beginning to think of adaptation strategies to ensure that there is some kind of civilizational element in South Africa in 2060, in 2080, that isn't reliant on the very things that result in climate catastrophe. And this reliance on fossil fuels and the rhetoric around the inequality of global north, global south transitions, that has to be resolved, certainly, but that cannot be the excuse for ensuring that young people today have no future in the second half of the century.
But how do we resolve that? On the one hand, you're hearing of the establishment of possibly a second state-owned entity like Eskom to resolve these problems, and if that is the solution, what happens to the existing Eskom, for example, but also this proliferation of the procurement from independent power producers. Surely that has to be more measured, and it has to be logical in keeping with the just transition that we've been talking about. But given what's happened with load shedding and the energy crisis, do you think that that has been tossed aside so that we will just find a solution anyway, anyhow?
So I think one of the problems that we see in this issue is the notion of the ANC as a broad church, which has been around for decades. And in that broad church, competing opinions aren't being resolved. So what you cannot have in a situation of dire emergency is a kind of broad consensus that is reached over a long period of time. This is an emergency. We have an energy crisis, but we also have a climate crisis. And we shouldn't have to make a choice between whether we have energy or whether we have catastrophe. Those two things can be married. The science tells us that it is possible. We have perfect conditions in this country for solar energy, for wind energy. There is, radical, kind of technological shift that is going to make it possible. The foot dragging seems to be administrative rather than necessarily scientifically and technically motivated. They're the preferences that will result in money making rather than the preferences that will ensure that there is some kind of environment for young people who will then be in their old age to survive. And those choices are being made by people who are old now and are unlikely to see even 2030, never mind 2050. And that kind of imbalance also speaks to the imbalance between the governed and the governors in this country. Those who govern are often very old. Most South Africans are under the age of 30. The average age for young people is 27. So we're sitting with a situation where people are making decisions that they won't have to live with, and the consequences of which won't be visited on them. And in that sense, South Africa's governors are very much like governors elsewhere in the world. They're making decisions that have very short-term gains for them and their immediate, shall we say, connections or their party, but have very long-term negative consequences for everybody else who will survive into the second half of the 2000s.
And depending on how you look at it, it speaks, of course, to that very fine balance that you have to strike. As you say, the climate and, of course, our environment around us being one, but equally, if people don't have jobs and they don't have anything to eat, they still might not make it to 2030.
Absolutely. And this idea that jobs are tied to coal and fossil fuels is a myth that is very much inside certain sectors of this party. We know that you can create jobs in the renewable sector, and you also have to create jobs for the people currently employed and reskill them in those fossil fuel industries, because South Africa cannot be number 13 on the list of global emitters and continue to think that business will run as usual. And partly we're as high up on that list because of Eskom and because of the mining industry. So if we're going to reorient ourselves economically, as the discussion documents point out, there is a so-called fourth industrial revolution, and I'm not even going to touch on whether or not that's a real thing. We have to ask ourselves very tough questions about whether the people who are planning this have a coherent vision, whether that coherent vision can come out of a policy conference, and a policy conference that seems to have ideological battles, but also factional battles over resources, and whether or not that debate is necessarily tapped in enough into the scientific material that is available, the debates that are being had, the philosophical and ideological consequences of debates that have been had in, I mean, much of the document, quotes and invokes Marxism, but it's a Marxism that's very much caught in the 20th century. It's as if nobody has written anything in Marxian theory since 1980, and one wants to ask whether the people who construct these documents have read anything since 1980, because that's 40 years ago. You cannot continue to just rely on those old debates because your organization is invested in them. The world is unfolding into catastrophe as we speak. Feminism and its engagement with Marxism, ecological debates and climate science, its engagement with Marxism, Marxism's engagement with current economic conditions, none of that is reflected in this document at any great depth. There is selective quotation of Emmanuel Wallerstein, of Thomas Piketty, but there isn't a sustained engagement with the real conditions of the 21st century, because for so much of the party and its leadership, they're caught in 20th century ideas for 21st century problems.
So how do they resolve this? And of course, not saying that this is the solution for South Africa, because South Africa has, a plethora of political parties from which to choose from, where they can decide who to vote for and the direction that they want the country to move into. But as things stand right now, as far as the African National Congress and its allies are concerned, who do they turn to if they are to change things?
We have scores of universities in this country and research institutes, including the Human Sciences Research Council, the National Research Foundation, the Centre for Scientific and Industrial Research, among others. All of these people indicate all sorts of issues, research done at the highest level about what solutions possibly are. We have a governing party, a majority party, that other parties in the world would look at their results and go, oh, good grief, if only we could get those percentages. They're looking at those percentages in panic, but they're not paying attention to the very people that their deployees in government fund. These are public research institutions, and it is important for the governing party to look at that research, for its cadres, its members, its delegates, to look at that research and have that research inform their deliberations, so that this isn't just a debate that is at the ideological level of politics, it's a debate that's engaged with the realities of what the research tells us is happening around us and how that research can inform better policy making. And that, I think, is a gap currently, because the party points out that this is an issue. When it talks about the caliber of its cadres and delegates, the caliber of discussions in its branches, and also the way in which professional skills then don't enter the party because of the way in which cadre deployment happens around patronage networks and people's own personal agendas.
And speaking of, quite apart from the African National Congress, if you come to us as ordinary South Africans, the energy crisis and what it means to us, there are so many questions that remain unanswered. For example, you move into this emergency mode where you're trying to resolve the crisis, but do we know how much this is going to cost? Because however much it costs, you and I will be footing that bill. Do we know who the beneficiaries are? Do we know, how much, again, is being spent by Eskom? Because we know Eskom spoke about leasing land in Mpumalanga to some of these independent power producers. Who are they? Should we not be concerned about that?
Absolutely. And in a country like South Africa, where you have a constitutional democracy that separates the three branches of government, it's absolutely essential for those who we elect, the legislatures, full of those people, should be holding the executive to account. Decisions made in cabinet should be investigated by parliamentary oversight committees. And the fact that those committees haven't done the full job of revealing things and then reported to the people of South Africa what their findings have been is of real concern. The fact that these energy questions don't just have the literal monetary costs of socializing debt, They have other costs, which as ordinary South Africans, we have the right to know. What is the prospect of for a future for our children in a country with the energy policy we currently have? We cannot continue to have ministers simply represent their version, and it then becomes the Fourth Estate's job to interrogate those versions. It becomes absolutely essential for the elected members to do so. And for this party, it has to reflect very critically about how its members are the majority in several of those legislatures and have to do that work on behalf of the citizens. After all, its deployees in government, whether they're in the provincial legislature or the national legislature, take oaths of office to the Constitution to protect the interests of the people of South Africa before they protect the interest of the party. And they come from a history where the head of the party in a previous administration said, the party comes first, the country comes second. They cannot have that.
Well, the current head of the party still says that.
We need a space where the country comes first, the planet comes first, life itself comes first, and the party must serve that primary objective, which is us, our quality of life. And their documents are full of this. They want to deliver a good quality of life, jobs, dignity, etc. That's all part of being alive. And to ensure that our lives must come before the party's interests. And that's very difficult for a party with the internal divisions that the ANC has, and with the battles over positions of power that will give people access to levers over the resources that government allows them to have. And that shift is, I think, a very difficult one that the policy documents admit is a difficult shift to make, but is an essential shift to make if the party wishes to survive. And survival is at the core of what the party says is crucial in this moment. Its own research tells it 2024 is looking dodgy. Its own research tells it that if it wants to be around by 2030, it will have to do very hard work to fix itself internally, as well as address the external problems visited upon South Africa if it is in government.
And we'll, of course, unpack more of those policy positions for you as we navigate our way throughout this 3-hour morning live broadcast for you. And, of course, as soon as that press briefing starts, we'll take you there as well. But for now, it's back to studio. Leanne, I think it's time for headlines.